I want to start off with this idea that we talk about in psychology a lot, that our minds are embodied. You cannot disambiguate the mind from the body's ability to act in its environment. And, bless you, as part of that, we have to think about, okay, what is the context in which our bodies developed, our minds developed? And one of the things we're going to talk about today is the fact that your brain doesn't give 2 iotas worth of crap about portraying the truth. Your brain only cares about conveying to you what's necessary for you to survive and pass along your genes. And we see this all the time, right? Various visual illusions. Remember when the dress, that black and blue versus white and gold or whatever it was, went viral, right? People were flabbergasted that I could be looking at the exact same thing as somebody and have a completely different perception of reality. And I think this is a really key aspect of what I want to talk about today. Because we evolved to be social creatures. Right? We can talk about the evolutionary purpose of being social, but we evolved not in isolation, but to coexist with others within our species. But we obviously evolved in a specific way. Right? We're already seeing some of the ramifications of technology and disparate social networks, the integration of things like phones. And this is a profoundly different social engagement than we evolved with. But remember, we also evolved with these pressures of survival. Your brain cared about getting you the nutrients, keeping you away from the tiger, and passing along your genes. The truth didn't matter. Objective reality didn't matter. What mattered is what got you to the point of survival. And as such, we've created a whole host of what we would call heuristics and biases. In the late, I'll say 20th century, because it always tickles my students when I talk about being from the late 1900s, but the late 20th century, the whole field of economics was uprooted by this idea of an irrational actor. Economics, to that point, had been entirely focused on this idea of normative decision-making. That the rational actor will always make the choice that results in the optimum outcome. And then some folks like Kahneman and Tversky came along and said, hey, look at all the ways that people are irrational. People actually pay money to penalize somebody. Right? That's an irrational position to take. But again, we can think about the fact that these heuristics and biases evolved to allow us to survive better. And we have a whole bunch of them in decision making, but I want to talk about a host of these heuristics and these biases in the context of human-machine interaction. And so the first kind of broad perspective in this CASA framework or CASA framework of computers or social actors has been expanded upon since '94. But the general idea is that humans treat media and computers like real people, mindlessly applying scripts, like we just heard, for interacting with humans to interactions with social technologies. We're going to talk about some case studies at the end of the talk here that really illustrate the human expectations. Remember, we evolved to be social, and wherein we are interacting with things that start giving us signals that they are even remotely intelligent, we start applying these biases, these heuristics that we evolved with to these systems. There's also this idea that things which are human-like, we attribute human might to, human strengths to. We tend to ascribe human capabilities to systems which either look like humans or behave like humans. Robots that are more humanoid, we have human-like expectations of. There have been a whole host of examples of humanoid robotics companies that start off with a lot of promise and then wind up going bankrupt not long after. Right? And one of the explanations for this is you are creating this expectation of capability of this robotic platform by making it look human, but it's inherently not there. Right? So the more human-like something is, the more competent we expect it to be. We also have gendered expectations. We perceive systems of the opposite sex as being more credible and engaging. But we also prefer systems that match gender occupational roles. We typically like systems that fit in with our expectations, again, these biologically evolved expectations of women more typically in caretaking roles, men more typically in high risk or aggressive roles. There's also this interesting idea of what's been labeled as the form-function attribution bias. So if you look at the robot here on the left-hand side of the screen, that's Baxter. It's an industrial robot. With its base, it stands about 6 feet tall. You can see the size of its arms. But if you look at the actual specifications of this robot, despite looking like, Arnold Schwarzenegger took an extra dose of steroids, it can only hold 5 pounds. This is a complete mismatch of expectations between what this system looks like and the capabilities of the system. Again, we evolved to have expectations of large humans being able to move large amounts of weight. And so you get this discrepancy between the expectation of the system and the actual system's capability. We also have this perfect automation schema. We expect machines and computers to make fewer errors than humans do. But paradoxically, this means that when a computer or a machine or system makes an error, we're more likely to detect it. Subsequently, we then rely on that machine less, even if that machine may be better at doing that task than we are. You see this also in estimations of one's own competence. So 75% of people think they're better than average at driving. The math doesn't work like that, right? But this is one of the obstacles that companies like Tesla or these other self-driving manufacturers are going to have to overcome with, they could in theory, and I don't think the systems are there yet, but I think they could in theory make the vehicles safer than any human could operate them. But people have this inflated sense of their own capabilities. Again, we can tie back to various biological imperatives for it. We also want adherence to kind of these human traits. Again, as social creatures, we evolved with these expectations of reciprocity, of certain politeness. It turns out we don't like it when systems don't say please or thank you. We also really don't like it when these virtual personal assistants or robots that we have a mental model of being subservient to us refuse orders. Now, I know we're not talking about conversational agents today, but you can see this in real-world examples wherein people with ChatGPT or Bard or these other large language models tell the system to do something and it doesn't do it. They get frustrated. They find clever ways around some of these safeguards. We also have expectations of adherence to social norms. We're going to talk about some examples in just a minute here. But we've seen situations wherein AI has been released onto Twitter. People figure out how to manipulate the algorithm, and the AI turns pretty racist pretty quickly. Right? We clearly have expectations that that's inappropriate and therefore should be avoided. But going back to these sort of biases and heuristics and the evolution evolutionary forces that got us to where we are, we have a propensity to see faces where there are none. Right? We want to see biology, we want to see evidence of other creatures, of people, where there are none. Similarly, we see sentience where there is none. We all want to believe that our dogs have senses of humor and are deliberately trying to make us laugh. The reality is they don't have that level of cognition. But similarly, once these systems start acting human-like or even expressing human-like emotions, people can be tricked into thinking, okay, this is a sentient system, like we saw with Google. But we also see human characteristics where there are none. And this is going to be a subtlety, I think, worth talking about. These systems cannot be racist or biased, because they are trained to find patterns in data that we provide to them. If we think about the actual objective definition of what it means to be racist or bigoted, right, it is frequently a bias in opposition to otherwise observable facts. But when we limit the environment in which we are training these systems, we are imposing any of these things on the systems, and then instead of looking a priori to see what was it about this training process that led to these results, although I'll say we're getting better at it, we label the system, which removes the requirements for us to improve. And so I want to give a couple case studies. Normally when I talk about this in class, my students just look at me, with their eyes glassy and have no recollection of Clippy. But if y'all have interacted, and I realize there's some students in the back who probably don't know what the hell we're talking about here. But if you remember, Microsoft's Clippy assistant was, at the time, a fairly kind of advanced Bayesian reasoning system that would provide a degree of assistance. But the problem is, Microsoft didn't consider the user sufficiently. One of the things that would happen with Clippy is it would pop up on the screen, it would be attention grabbing, but it refused to leave until you stopped what you were doing and acknowledged it. Right? It would say, it looks like you're writing a letter. Do you want help with that? You could not continue to write that letter until you said, no, thank you. And then if it was on screen and it hadn't provided a prompt, it would, kind of like a toddler, I don't mean to be pejorative, but kind of like a toddler, knock on the screen, turn itself into a bicycle, go away, right? It was very attention-getting, which, as we know from kind of the task switching literature, the workload literature, is not a great rollout of these types of technologies. Again, advanced, very useful, but when we consider what the human's expectations are for interactions with these systems, it kind of went belly up. Now, if none of y'all are familiar, or if any of y'all are not familiar with Replica, Replica was a chatbot that was rolled out initially as an attempt to kind of stave off issues of isolation, of depression. The founder said this was created in response to one of his or her friends, I can't remember the CEO, but one of his or her friends committing suicide. And this was a stated objective. However, if you go to Replica's website now and interact with it, it becomes very flirtatious very quickly, and the company guides you to look at what could be available behind the paywall. And what they advertise are, as they say, not safe for work role play and racy photos. Right? People took a system that was providing this sort of support, emotional support, and they started developing attachments to it. And there is an entire subreddit culture You can go look at people who are self-professed dating their replica. Right? Again, these are the biological imperatives. We are social creatures. We need to find companionship. And all too often, we're providing that opportunity for companionship in something that cannot reciprocate, but does a pretty good job approximating the feeling for the individual. So I think it helps to, again, contextualize our brain within this discussion. Over the course of evolution, tools used to be sticks and stones. We obviously evolved and developed greater and more powerful tools. But now, they have no problems beating us at chess, creating art, frankly, giving a lot more creative responses than my students to a lot of essay prompts. But again, we are focusing now not so much on these systems being tools, but as the first speaker kind of alluded to, of being teammates, right? And as the framing of this conversation, what I'm hearing is these are not decision-making tools. These are a non-biological entity in the room helping you with those decisions. And the bottom line of kind of what I want to hammer home here is we took a chimpanzee brain and forced it into this reality where it may not be the smartest entity on the planet anymore. It's interacting with systems that are not biologically limited. The speed of cognition of the systems we're interacting with are not limited by, our very fleshy vehicles. And so now we are trying to understand artificial intelligence, and we're trying to understand the developments of these technologies through the lens that we evolved with. We talk about these systems knowing and understanding. I think there are people in here a lot smarter than I am who would probably take some exception to this idea that an AI system knows anything. Right? But again, we are trying to anthropomorphize because of our experiences over the course of evolution to try and make sense of our environment, understand what is a threat, which is why we get such kind of dramatization of things like Terminator or Ex Machina, right? These expectations of threats in these AI systems. But it's also why we turn to these systems to look for companionship and as a substitute for human affection. So really quickly, a lot of the work we're doing here is funded by the Army. I just want to thank them for that, and I welcome any questions or comments.
All right, so we have a question in the back first, and I see you over there, Dr. Barnard.
Excellent presentation. Thank you so much. As a Microsoft person, I appreciate
Sorry.
the Clippy reference. Don't apologize. Okay. No. And if anybody wants a Clippy sticker, I happen to bring some today. So I'm really interested in the conversation around how we have, as humans, started to offload responsibility and recuse ourselves for maybe some of our immoral behaviors and give those responsibilities and villainize over to AI. And so I think you're tangentially calling that out, and it's something that I'm very curious about. So if you know about how Microsoft is moving forward with sort of the sentiment of co-pilot, right? I think it's kind of in line with that. But just curious your thoughts and sort of future study around offloading responsibility for some of those things that have been called out, whether it be racism, biases, bigotry, et cetera, to give ownership to the AI of some of the things that we don't like about ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, I picked on Microsoft, so let me just say I love Microsoft's approach as they're moving forward on these things. But yeah, so let me answer the question kind of in the context that I'm most familiar with my research, and that's self-driving cars. So I've done a whole bunch of research with self-driving cars. I actually own a Tesla myself. It drove me here. But I think you you are seeing this kind of diffusion of everybody wants to point the finger at everybody else when something goes wrong, right? Now, Tesla has a team of very highly paid and educated attorneys that have done everything they can to make sure that if I were to hit and kill somebody while the car was driving me here today, that was going to be my fault, right? The most recent recall that Tesla just went through was to advance their driver monitoring system, such that I actually got a negative check on, like, it disengaged the autopilot, said I couldn't do it for the rest of the drive. I don't know why. It thought I wasn't looking at the road, but I was, right? But getting to that point of, where are we moving forward? There is a lot of interesting work about kind of, and this ties to their first speaker, but the perceptions of agency of these systems that, because of things like the perfect automation schema, we think that if a system that is supposed to act perfectly winds up killing somebody, it must be malevolent in some sort of way, right? There's no way this could have just been an accident. And I think there's going to be a lot to kind of reconcile with those things, and I don't know what the best approach is, and that's why I'm excited to talk to, especially a lot of the philosophers in here, about what even is morality and ethics. My knowledge kind of stops at Hume's guillotine, and so I look forward to kind of talking about that. But.
Hi there.
Yeah.
Enjoyed the talk tremendously, and I'm sort of on board about 99%. And the place I wanted to jump off was exactly the place we were talking about with respect to offloading things like bias. So I'm a philosopher by training, but it seems to me that, and I think this grows out of the evolutionary approach that you're advocating here, is that when we confront the world, there's a sense in which we're automatically categorizing things into agents and non-agents, right? So even if you tell a story that says, like, the real agents are the biological agents and these things are artificial agents, in a sense that's unfair to the non-human agents, because if there are non-human agents, things capable of acting upon us, right, then they seem to have a real sort of agency that creates sort of a third classification between the natural agent and the natural non-agent. There's now this third classification. And it strikes me that if you take the story you told about an artificial agent exhibiting biased behavior and then saying that it's not really biased or it doesn't embody bias because it has this genealogy where it was trained up in a certain way, and so the real responsibility resides with us because we trained it that way. That same story, when you apply it to a human being, right? If you say you take a child and you raise it in like a neo-Nazi training camp or something, and then it goes out into the world and behaves in racist ways, we don't say of it that it's excused for its racism, right? The behaviors are still racist. The attitudes it manifests linguistically and behaviorally are still racist. We explain where the racism came from by telling that origin story, but we don't excuse the racism. So I'm a little curious about the choice or where we're carving up the world in terms of different kinds of agents, where we excuse the artificial agent for doing exactly the same thing that the biological agent does, and say that it's sort of guilt-free. I understand, the case with the legal liability issues with self-driving cars and everything, but it's easy to envision a world where this generation of agents creates the next generation of agent, and it sort of goes off and self-trains in various ways. And if it emerges racist, I want to call it a racist bot, right? I don't want to excuse it. So
I think that's a really interesting question, and I hesitate to even bring up the idea of free will in a room of people that know much more about the conversation about it than I do. But I think what I see as the distinction is you can add noise parameters into these AIs, but largely AI is deterministic. Same input will give you the same output, right? Now, you can add noise parameters to vary that, and that's what essentially the ChatGPT wrapper, reinforcement learning, but is doing there. And so what I see as the distinction is I don't blame my Roomba for assaulting my dog when it runs into it because I don't think it had a choice. There was something that was programmed into it a priori that was going to, given that same set of circumstances, run into my dog there. I think the distinction I see is that, and I think you're exactly right that there is a question to be had, and folks like Sam Harris talk about this biological determinism and whatnot. But I think the distinction that I see is that I attribute the ability to make alternative decisions to humans, and I don't make that same attribution to AI. But I think kind of the crux is, where does that decision making lie? Do we have the ability to make a decision? Does AI have the ability to make a decision? And I don't think we're at the point where the AI really has the ability to make a decision, so to speak.
So my question is going to be very different because it's focusing on a point you were making at the end about how the tools are now better than us at so many things. And I'm coming at this from the perspective of an educator who has spent a lot of time in curriculum development and talked a lot about Bloom's taxonomy and how a lot of the ways that the tools have evolved is they've essentially been moving up the taxonomy. And so I'm wondering if there are any directions that you're aware of or any thoughts that you have on rethinking the nature, actually the focus of human intelligence and human cognition and our understanding of what the goals should be and how we're defining it that way, specifically in relation to how we interact with tools, because of the fact that this interaction, these power dynamics are essentially changing, that we have less power over our tools than previously. That are there attempts to rethink what we should be doing from an education standpoint because of these changes in relation to tools?
Yeah, man, that is such a great question in the sense that, Elon once said something that kind of stuck with me, and I'm sure he wasn't the first one to say it, but we are currently cyborgs, right? We all have computers in our pocket. I teach our statistics classes, and my students cannot do long division by hand. But given a calculator, they are much more fast, much more accurate than my parents' generation was doing long division, right? And so I think this gets to the crux of kind of the question of what is intelligent? Have we become more or less intelligent? Do we know more things now than we used to? Probably. Do we have fewer capabilities? I think probably. And so I think the question then becomes, do we focus on kind of the human augmented intelligence that is with the appropriate tools, the requisite tools, can you excel and exceed? And I think we see some of the arguments for this being played out in policy debates of we need to give access to technology to all underserved populations to provide this sort of augmentation. That being said, I think this is where I'm really kind of excited to hear from folks like you, in the sense that it seems to me like the way I teach my classes needs to fundamentally change, or everybody's going to get 100% in all of my classes moving forward. And I don't necessarily think that's because they're more intelligent in the traditional sense, but they're augmented in a way that really benefits it. So, a great question. I don't really have an answer. So.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Thanks. Great talk. So I'm curious about, you mentioned our preference for adhering to gender expectations, even with artificial agents. So I was on a team a couple of years ago. We were designing an agent, and we found research that said people prefer, or people do better getting instructions from a male voice, but getting information from a female voice. So we had to make a decision as designers: is our agent going to be male or female? And we said, okay, the data is telling us that we should do this to get better outcome. But we pretty quickly realized that we would be reinforcing that same pattern. So, you talked about legal liability. I wonder about the ethical liability of designers, and if there's any insight that you've gained that where we could make a better, or more informed anyway, decision.
Yeah, man, that's tough. I think when we start conceptualizing a lot of these tools moving forward, the default answer is going to be customizability. You can change Siri to be male, to be female, to meet your desires, but then it becomes what is the default, right? I don't have an educated answer to that question. I think the default that I would rely upon is what gets the best result on the human performance metric that I'm interested in. Now you have to prioritize again, what is the metric that you're interested in? But I think it's a foundational kind of question. I like it.
Beautiful. Let's thank our speaker one more time.